The radio cut out mid-sentence, right when our headlamps found the first red flag, and that was the moment I stopped believing we were chasing two lost kids and started believing we were being managed by someone who knew the swamp better than any map ever could. This is a fictionalized account built from real search and rescue procedure and the kinds of calls that happen in places like this, told straight and without exaggeration. It was September 2014 in Virginia's Great Dismal Swamp, and the water was already up in the low areas from the week's weather, sitting black and still under the brush like a second sky that never reflected light. 3 of us stood in ankle-deep water on a narrow maintenance spur that looked like a trail if you didn't know the difference, and we were looking for 2 teenagers who never made it back to their car after sunset. The canals cut the refuge into long lanes that ended in nowhere, and the tree cover swallowed the morning in a way that made every direction feel the same. Somewhere ahead, a man moved through reeds with a shotgun and a plastic bag of survey flags, and he had been planting those flags all day, not to help, but to steer us into the places where radios went quiet and the ground went soft. The search leader tried to call for backup, but the channel filled with static that sounded like wet sand grinding, then went dead, as if a hand had closed around the signal and squeezed. We followed the flags anyway, because people do that when they are scared and hopeful at the same time, and because a thin trail of dropped candy wrappers looked fresh enough to be real. 100 yards later, we found the teenager's drone, smashed and half submerged, its lights still blinking like it refused to accept that it was done. One of our searchers stepped off the narrow path and sank hard, as if the ground had been cut away under the leaf mat, and when the others reached for him, a shot cracked through the trees, and the swamp answered with silence, the kind of silence that feels deliberate. By the time the rescue trucks finally saw our lights through the brush, only one man was still on his feet, and he was hurt badly enough that he kept his face turned away like he didn't want anyone to read it. Let me walk you through how that day unfolded, step by step, because the details matter in a place like that, and because the whole thing only makes sense when you see how the pieces were arranged. At the time, I was 34, working as a search and rescue officer on a team that did a little of everything, from overdue hikers to missing kids to vehicle recoveries when someone thought a short scenic drive meant any dirt road was safe. I had seen people vanish in plain sight without any mystery involved, just bad choices, bad ground, and the kind of panic that makes someone run when the smart move is to stop. My name is Miles Keegan, and I learned early that a swamp does not have to be deep to be dangerous. It just has to be patient. That morning started with a call from dispatch at 5:18 a.m., and the dispatcher kept it clinical the way they are trained to do, but I could hear the strain behind it. 2 teenagers, last seen inside the refuge the night before, did not return to their vehicle, and their parents had tracked their phones to a parking lot near Washington Ditch Access. Both phone locations had stayed pinned there for hours, like the devices had stopped moving at the exact moment the kids stopped making decisions. Phones don't tell you what happened. They just stop talking, and people treat that silence like a clue instead of what it usually is, which is an empty space where fear rushes in and fills everything. By 6 a.m., I was under the lot light with a clipboard, a paper map that already looked damp around the edges, and a GPS unit that would be useful until the tree cover got thick enough to make it hesitate. A minivan sat crooked across 2 spaces with the kind of parking job that says, "I got here too fast and I didn't care where the tires went." The doors were locked, windows fogged faintly from the inside, and the hood had that warm look that means someone had been there all night, turning the key on and off, running the heater in short bursts, trying to make time behave. A woman leaned on the hood and stared at the tree line like it owed her something, rubbing the same spot of paint with her thumb until the motion became a twitch. A man stood beside her with his arms locked across his chest and his jaw working like he was chewing something hard he couldn't swallow. I approached slow with open hands because when parents are in that state, you don't surprise them and you don't talk like an authority figure unless you have to. "Morning," I said. "I'm Miles. I'm with Search and Rescue." The woman's eyes snapped to my face like she had been waiting for any new person to appear, because new people mean the story might move again. "Where are they?" she asked. "We're going to look for them," I said, keeping my voice even. "Tell me their names." "Jenna Whitcomb," she said fast, and then she swallowed and forced the next one out. "And Landon Pruitt. They were just filming. They had a drone. They were practicing."
The father cut in with a flat voice that sounded like it had been scraped raw. "They're good kids. They don't run off." I nodded once, because there's nothing useful you can say to that without sounding like you're correcting them, and the swamp doesn't care if you're good. Ground doesn't give credit for intention.
Deputy Renee Alvarez from Suffolk arrived a few minutes later in a marked unit, and she got out with that calm, contained posture that cops learn when they don't want anyone to see what they're thinking. With her was a refuge officer named Tommy Gray, green uniform shirt, clean badge, and boots that still looked like they hadn't found their first real mud yet. Tommy had the right attitude, eager and ready, but eagerness doesn't weigh anything when the place you're entering has had 100 years to become what it is. 2 volunteers met us at the lot as well, because in the early hours, people want to help, and some of them can. Brett Silas was the first, the type who signs up for everything, high energy, talking big, backpack loaded like he was on a weekend adventure. The other was a quiet older man named Hank Miller, who said very little and carried extra water without being asked, as if he was there to outlast the day rather than impress anyone inside it. At 6:25 a.m., I laid out the plan on the hood of the minivan with the parents watching every pen movement like it mattered. We would start with the obvious routes, then widen in controlled sweeps, because the moment you let desperation dictate direction, you end up following your own anxiety into the worst possible ground. We would walk the boardwalk trail first, then split into 2 sweep teams along the ditch line, checking the higher berms and the maintenance spurs that people mistake for trails when they are trying to shortcut back to a lot. Tommy tapped the map with his finger. "There's an old maintenance spur that bends here," he said. "It looks like a trail, but it isn't, and it ends in a mess." "Any signs posted?" I asked. "Some," he said. "Not enough. People ignore them anyway." Renee glanced toward the tree line, scanning for vehicles, movement, anything that looked wrong in the morning light. "Any hunters out there today?" she asked. "Not supposed to be," Tommy said. "But you know how it is." I did know how it is. If a boundary line exists, someone tests it, and if a rule exists, someone looks for the gap that lets them pretend they didn't see it. We moved out at 6:40 a.m., and the light inside the swamp came in thin, filtered through leaves and hanging moss, making everything a shade of muted green and brown that never looked fully awake. The air felt heavy in a way that makes your shirt cling before you've done any work, but I didn't focus on that. I focused on the ground, on edges, on the places where something could change without you noticing until it was too late. Jenna's mother walked with us at first, because parents always try to attach themselves to the search like their presence will keep the worst thing from happening. She kept speeding up, and twice I had to slow her down, not by grabbing her, just by stepping into her line and speaking in a low voice she had to pay attention to. "You can't help them if you break yourself," I told her. She nodded like she understood, then took 2 more fast steps anyway, because understanding and control are different things when your kid is missing. By 7:10 a.m., we reached the boardwalk split, where the path forked and the railing ran along the darker water. That's where I saw the first thing that made my stomach tighten in a way I recognized from other bad scenes, because it wasn't dramatic, it was just wrong. A red survey flag, bright and clean, tied to the railing with a neat knot that didn't belong on public trail hardware. It wasn't drooping or tangled. It was placed like a message. Brett grinned like he'd been waiting for evidence we were on the right track. "Good," he said. "They marked their way." "No," I said, and my tone came out sharper than I meant, because sometimes you have to kill a comforting idea before it spreads. That isn't how kids mark a trail, and that isn't refuge tape. He looked at me, confused, like I'd rejected a gift. Tommy leaned closer and frowned. "We don't stock red flags," he said. "We use orange." Renee touched the flag with one gloved finger, careful and light. "Fresh," she said. "That knot is fresh." We moved forward, and within 50 yards we saw another red flag, and then another, always at eye level, always tied where it would be noticed, like someone wanted us to keep moving and wanted us to do it without stopping to debate. Hank stopped and pointed down at the edge of the boardwalk where the packed dirt began. Candy wrappers, a small line of them, spaced out like breadcrumbs, the kind of trash you find in a teenager's pocket, and the kind of thing that can be either an accident or a deliberate lure depending on who dropped it. That part could be them, I said, because I wasn't going to ignore the only organic sign we had. But I also wasn't going to pretend it felt clean. We followed the wrappers off the boardwalk and onto the packed dirt spur Tommy had warned about. It narrowed fast, just a ribbon of firmer ground with black water on both sides, and the water held floating leaves that didn't move even when we did, making it feel less like a natural surface and more like a lid. At 7:35 a.m., Landon's phone rang. It wasn't a distant vibration or a faint buzz. It was a clean ringtone, loud enough that all of us heard it and froze at the same time. Jenna's father had called and called all night, and it had gone straight to voicemail, but now it rang like it had waited for daylight to make sure we would be here to hear it. The sound came from ahead, maybe 30 yards into the brush. Brett took 2 steps forward like his body moved before his brain finished asking permission. "I've got it," he said. "Stop," I said, and I put a hand up. "Everybody stop right there." He froze, half-turned, and I could see the argument forming in his face, the idea that I was slowing down the rescue for no reason. Renee crouched and scanned the ground instead of looking toward the sound, because cops who've been around know that the loudest thing in a trap is the part you are supposed to look at. She wasn't searching the trees. She was searching the gaps, the places where the dirt changed color, the places where something linear didn't belong. "There," she said, and she pointed at shin height. A thin line stretched across the path, nearly invisible unless your eyes were tuned for it. It wasn't a vine. It sat too straight. Up close, I saw it was clear fishing line. Brett's face drained. "What's it tied to?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately because I didn't like the answer, and because in a swamp, the far end of a line can be anything from a simple trip hazard to something worse, and you don't announce your fear like it's a fact. The line ran into the brush and disappeared into roots and leaf litter. Tommy whispered, "Trap?" "Could be," I said. "Could be a warning. Either way, it's not an accident." I used a multi-tool and cut the line in the middle, and nothing snapped, nothing swung, nothing revealed itself. That should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. It felt like the line wasn't meant to trigger a device. It was meant to make someone step wrong, fall, get soaked, get slow, get separated, and in this terrain, those are all the same thing. We moved slower after that, spacing ourselves out, eyes down, then up, then down again, the rhythm of careful movement in a place that punishes carelessness quietly. At 8:05 a.m., we found the phone. It sat on a small patch of dry ground, face up, screen cracked, still powered on, and it looked placed, not dropped. People drop phones in a panic, and they bounce, they slide, they land wrong. This one was set like someone wanted it to be found, like someone wanted us to believe we were close. Renee held up a gloved hand. "Don't touch," she said. I nodded and marked the spot on my GPS. "Tommy, call it in. Possible evidence. We need a perimeter sooner than later." Tommy lifted his radio, keyed it, then lowered it again with a look that didn't belong on a trained officer. "Nothing," he said. Renee tried hers, switching channels, trying the standard calls, giving it a few extra seconds like patience might coax the signal back. "Dead zone," she said. "We're not that far from the lot." I hated that. Radios fail in distance or terrain, but they don't usually fail like a switch has been flipped. The failure felt intentional, and I didn't know if it was because the swamp ate the signal or because someone was doing something to make sure we couldn't coordinate. Brett shifted his pack, trying to stay optimistic like that was his job. "Maybe the truck repeater is down," he offered. "Maybe," I said, because I wasn't going to argue guesses. "Or maybe somebody doesn't want us talking." No one spoke after that. Even Brett went quiet, because once a person realizes the environment is not the only variable, they start hearing their own breathing in a way they didn't a minute ago. We left the phone where it was, flagged it with our own marker, and moved on, one step at a time, watching for more line, for disturbed ground, for any sign the kids had moved under their own power. At 8:40 a.m., Hank found the drone. It sat half in the water and half on mud, as if someone had tried to hide it and then changed their mind, or got interrupted. The battery light blinked faintly, and the plastic arms were bent in a way that suggested impact rather than a gentle landing. Brett leaned in, eyes wide, already imagining the memory card. If the card's inside... "Hands off," Renee said, and she wasn't loud, but she didn't need to be. Tommy looked uneasy. "We secure it," he said. "Sheriff handles the rest." Renee pulled an evidence bag from her kit and slid the drone in without twisting it much, then sealed it. "This comes with us," she said. And in that moment, she wasn't just a deputy. She was the person imposing order on a scene that was trying to dissolve into chaos. We tried to reorient for a sweep, and that's when the red flag started to feel less like odd litter and more like a sentence being written one word at a time. They weren't random. They weren't marking a simple way out. They were guiding us in a curve away from the ditch and deeper into thicker ground where the trail vanished into brush and narrow islands of almost dry that can turn into traps if you trust them. I stopped beside one flag and studied the knot. Perfect. Not rushed, not clumsy. Not the kind of knot a kid ties when their hands are shaking. "This is someone working," I said. Brett forced a laugh that sounded wrong in the humid air. "Maybe another team put them up." "No other team is in here," I said. "We just arrived. If these were ours, I'd know who tied them." At 9:15 a.m., we found Jenna's shoe. A gray sneaker, clean enough to show its tread, lying on its side like it had been set down and forgotten. There was no mud caked into it. No scuffing along the toe, none of the ugly evidence you expect when someone loses a shoe by accident in a swamp. Renee stared at it for a long beat. "Placed," she said. Tommy swallowed. "Why would someone place a shoe?" Before I could answer, a single shot cracked through the trees. It wasn't close enough to feel in your chest, but it was close enough to change the entire day instantly. Birds lifted in a rough wave. The air went still again too fast. Brett flinched and spun, eyes wide, suddenly looking for the adult in the room even though he was one. "That wasn't a hunter," he said. Renee's pistol came out, pointed low, not aimed at a person yet because she didn't have one, but ready, because readiness is sometimes the only leverage you have. She listened, still as stone, then shook her head once. "Not random," she said. "That was a signal." We tried our radios again. Nothing but a faint hiss, like the swamp had decided it was the only voice allowed. I made a decision I didn't want to make because it felt like admitting we were behind. "We go back," I said. "We regroup at the lot and bring in more, and we don't keep walking into unknown ground with a shooter somewhere inside it." Brett opened his mouth, then closed it, and I saw him swallow the urge to argue because now he'd heard the shot too, and whatever optimism he'd brought in was getting heavy. Hank nodded once, like he'd expected the day to go this way from the start. We started back the way we came, and the red flags looked different now. Not bright, not helpful. Just marks showing exactly where we'd walked, like someone had been counting our steps and wanted a record. At 9:40 a.m., Brett stepped off the path. It wasn't the kind of mistake you make when you're careful. It was like the ground under him invited the step, like it looked just firm enough to trust, and that's how swamps get you. They don't announce their danger. They offer you a reasonable option and then punish you for taking it. His foot sank past the ankle, then past the shin, and the mud grabbed him with a suction that stole the breath from his voice. "Don't move," I said, because movement makes it worse, but panic doesn't follow instructions. He rocked back, and the mud took more of him. Renee grabbed his pack strap and pulled. It didn't budge. She planted her boots and tried again, and her shoulders tightened with effort. "Help," she said. I went low and spread my weight, grabbing Brett's forearm. His sleeve was soaked, his eyes huge, and I could feel his fear vibrating under his skin. "Get the rope," I said to Hank. Hank already had it out. He moved like he'd done this before, not like a volunteer collecting a story, but like a man who'd pulled people out of bad ground and didn't intend to fail again. Then another shot fired. This one was closer, and even before I understood where it came from, I saw Brett jerk in a way that didn't match the mud's pull. His face changed, his body went slack in my hands, and a dark stain spread across the fabric in a place that made Renee's jaw tighten hard. Renee said a short, controlled word under her breath, not shouted, not theatrical, just a reflex of anger. "Down," she ordered, and we dropped low behind a fallen log and the shallow rise of the path, because in that moment our job was no longer rescue. Our job was survival long enough to bring help back in. I scanned the tree line, but the brush hid everything, and that was the worst part.
You couldn't confirm where danger sat, but you could feel it pressing in from the angles you couldn't see.
Renee leaned close. "He's watching us," she said, and her voice was steady in a way I respected and hated at the same time. Brett tried to speak. "Miles," he managed, thin and weak. I crawled closer, keeping my profile low. "Stay still," I told him. "Keep breathing, we're here." His eyes shifted toward a red flag 10 feet away, and his mouth worked like he was trying to force the words out before the pain stole them. "He put those up," Brett whispered. "I saw him earlier." My throat tightened. "Where?" I asked. "By the lot," he said, breath catching. "Before daylight, near the signboard, like he belonged there."
Renee's face changed, and it wasn't fear exactly. It was the cold understanding that the scene didn't start when we entered the swamp. It started before we arrived.
"He was at our starting point," she said.
That meant he saw us gather, saw who came in, saw our gear, counted our numbers, and in a place like that, numbers are comfort until the other person also knows the number. Another shot punched bark off the log above us and threw splinters into my hair. Renee fired 2 controlled rounds into the brush, not because she saw him, but because sometimes you shoot at the place a person would be if they were doing what you would do, and you hope it buys you time. It bought us 2 seconds. I used those seconds to hook the rope around Brett's chest and under his arms, careful not to yank him wrong. Hank tied it off with quick, practiced hands. "We pull on 3, I said. Renee nodded. Hank nodded. 1, I counted. 2, 3. We pulled. The mud fought us like it had a grudge. Brett's body shifted a few inches, then stopped, and he gasped a tight sound that wasn't a word. "I can't," he started. A shot snapped again, and Brett's body went heavy in my hands in a way that told me his fight had ended, whether I wanted to accept it or not. Renee froze for half a second, then she grabbed my shoulder and yanked me down hard. "Leave him," she said, and I hated her for it until my training reminded me she was right, because a dead man in bad ground turns into 2 dead men fast if you let your heart drive. Hank's eyes shone, but he didn't argue. He just tightened his grip on the rope until his knuckles went pale. Then he let it go, because the rope no longer had a job. We crawled backward, low and slow, moving by inches. The path narrowed and forced us single file, and every red flag we passed felt like an insult, a bright little reminder that someone else had planned this route. At 10:05 a.m., the brush opened into a wider service lane, half flooded but flatter, with tire tracks that looked recent enough to make my skin prickle. 60 yards away, a figure stood half hidden behind a cypress, shotgun held at waist height, not rushing, not shouting, just waiting like he owned the space between us. Renee lifted her pistol and squared her shoulders. "Drop it!" she yelled. The man turned without panic and walked into the brush like he'd heard that command 100 times and never cared. Calm, certain, like the swamp itself was his cover. Tommy's voice came out thin. "How does he know these lanes?" Hank answered, low and grim. "Because he built the path," he said. We moved, staying on what looked like higher spots, and that's when I saw what Hank meant. The red flags weren't random markers. They were a private map, a system, a way to move through ground most people fear, and the person who created it had done it over time, with practice, with repetition. The flags led toward a low mound of brush that looked wrong, too piled, too arranged, like a bad attempt at pretending nature had done it. A corner of blue tarp stuck out. Renee moved slow, gun still up. "Don't touch it," I said, but she already knew. We circled wide, scanning for lines, for wires, for anything that looked like another trip hazard. Under the brush, we found an opening, and inside was a shallow pit, not deep, not clean, a place someone used in a hurry. Landon was there. I won't dress it up. He was gone, and the swamp had already started to take the warmth out of him in that way water does. There was tape on his wrists, his clothes messed like he'd been dragged, and his eyes were open enough to make it feel like he was still watching the trees. Tommy turned away, hand over his mouth, and in that moment I stopped thinking of him as a new refuge officer and started thinking of him as another human being having the worst morning of his life. Renee's voice stayed steady, but her eyes didn't. "Where's the girl?" she asked. No one answered, because no one had an answer that wouldn't break something. We had one confirmed dead teenager, one fallen volunteer behind us,
one missing girl, and one armed man controlling the ground. I forced my breathing to slow, because if you breathe fast, your brain starts making sloppy decisions. "We're leaving," I said. "Now, we get help. We come back with airboats, dogs, and enough people that he can't keep steering us." Renee nodded once. Tommy looked shattered and tried his radio again like he could will it to work. "My radio." "Forget it," Renee said. "Follow me. Stay tight." We moved fast but controlled, staying on the boardwalk when we reached it, keeping our eyes forward and our shoulders low. The man didn't shoot again for a while, and that almost felt worse, like he didn't need to, like he was satisfied with what he'd already done. At 10:30 a.m., just past the boardwalk split, the radio bars on my unit climbed back to life, then dipped, then climbed again, and I keyed it without waiting for perfection. "Dispatch, this is Keegan," I said. "We've got an active shooter inside the refuge. 1 volunteer down, 1 juvenile confirmed deceased, 1 juvenile still unaccounted for. We need law enforcement, medical, and airboats at Washington Ditch access now." The reply came broken, but it came, and that's all I needed. "Copy," dispatch said. "Units en route. Stay safe." Renee exhaled through her teeth. "We're not done," she said, and she didn't mean the paperwork. We reached the lot at 10:55 a.m. and everything turned loud and bright. Sirens and doors and people moving with purpose. Jenna's parents ran toward us and I had to stop them with my hands. Not hard, just firm enough to keep them from following us back into the tree line out of sheer will. "Not yet," I said. Jenna's mother's face folded. "Where is she?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said, and the honesty tasted bitter. "But we're going back in with more people, and we're going to bring her out." By 11:20, AM airboats staged at the access, deputies formed a perimeter, and the sheriff himself showed up with a look that said he understood how quickly a missing kid case can turn into something else. He listened to Renee, watched the GPS points I'd marked, and didn't waste time trying to talk the scene into a simpler shape. At 11:40 a.m., we went back in with numbers, and the entire feeling changed the moment we pushed into the swamp with engines and radios and enough moving parts that one man couldn't quietly steer the story anymore. He tried to move again, but he couldn't move fast enough once airboats cut lanes through water he thought belonged only to him. Deputies pushed methodically, dogs worked the edges, and the shooter got flush toward the service lane where we'd seen him earlier, toward ground that gave him fewer hiding angles. That's where he made his last mistake. He grabbed Jenna. He dragged her by the arm through brush, trying to use her as cover, trying to force a clean exit by making everyone hesitate, because even the worst people understand that decent people pause when a kid is in front of a weapon. But Jenna fought him. Even exhausted, even scared, she fought in the messy, stubborn way teenagers can when they decide they are not going to cooperate with the plans someone else wrote for them. Renee saw them first. "Gun!" she shouted. The man raised the shotgun toward Renee, and time did that strange, slow thing it does when you know you are watching a decision happen in real time. Renee fired once, controlled and clean. The man dropped into shallow water, and the shotgun slid away and sank, swallowed by the black surface like it had never existed. 2 deputies rushed him, pinned his arms, and cuffed him while he still breathed. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the red flags like they were the only thing he trusted, like he couldn't understand why the markers didn't work anymore. We pulled Jenna back behind the line and wrapped her in a blanket. Her eyes stayed wide and fixed on the trees, and she flinched at every rustle like the swamp itself had learned her name. I crouched in front of her and kept my voice low. "Jenna," I said, "can you tell me your parents' names?" She blinked, swallowed, and whispered them. That's how I knew she was still present, still in her body, still able to grab onto something real. Later, they carried Brett out on a litter, and Hank walked behind them with his jaw clenched and his hands empty, the way people look when they are furious at the world, but don't have a place to put it. When the sheriff asked me what I wanted to say for the report, I kept it simple, because reports don't have room for the feeling of being guided like livestock by a man with string and flags. His name was Royce Halverson. He had worked survey crews around the refuge years earlier, and he knew the maintenance spurs, the soft pockets, the places where a person could step wrong and vanish without anyone seeing the exact second it happened. He lived out of a battered trailer off the highway and stole gear from parked cars at access points,
a quiet routine that let him survive without being noticed, until the day 2 teenagers flew a drone over something he didn't want seen. When deputies searched his pockets, they found a folded page from a notebook with a neat list of dates and access points going back months. Next to each line was one short mark, the same kind of mark you make if you're counting. No names, just counts. They asked me what the flags meant, why he used red, why they were always tied so clean, why they seemed to show up exactly where you didn't want to be. I told them the truth as plainly as I could. "They're his roads," I said. "They're how he remembers where he's been, and how he makes other people go where he wants." That afternoon, after medics cleared us and the parents went home with their daughter, I walked back to the boardwalk with a deputy watching my back. Because once you've been hunted in a place, you don't act like it's yours again just because the person is in cuffs. One red flag still hung from the railing, bright against the brown water, perfectly tied like a signature. I untied it and put it in my pocket, not as a trophy and not as a souvenir, but because I never wanted to see it hanging out there again, telling someone else a story that wasn't true,